A little girl whispered, "Choose her instead of me." What the rancher did. Next. Melted hearts. The Texas sun in 1870 pressed down like molten brass baking the border market until the dust turned into choking haze. Merchants shouted over cattle and hogs, buyers waved money, and animals bellowed in the heat. But farther off away from the main pens, another trade sat in silence, the sale of people. Women, most of them immigrants, leaned weakly against splintered rails. Their wrists were bound, their ankles rubbed raw from rope. Some were too weak to raise their heads. They were no longer bid upon, only waiting to be cleared out when the day ended. Caleb Ward did not intend to stop near them. He had only come for medicine for a sick horse. A tall man of nearly 40, he carried a limp from an accident years before. The brim of his hat shaded his face, but grief had long ago carved his features into stone. His wife had died 5 winters ago, and 2 months later, fever took his little daughter. Since then, Caleb had lived alone, running cattle and avoiding crowds. He moved past the human pens without slowing until something tugged his coat. When he looked down, a small girl stood barefoot in the dust. She couldn't have been more than 4. Her dark eyes were too large for her gaunt face, and her tangled hair clung to her cheeks. She whispered in halting English, her voice shaking, "You don't have to take me. Just take my mama." Caleb followed her pointing finger to a corner post. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, hung from the ropes tied around her wrists. Her lip was split, her eye swollen shut, and her skin pale beneath layers of dust. She barely breathed. "What's her name?" Caleb asked softly. The girl swallowed. "Maria. She's my mama. If no one buys her, they'll take her somewhere bad. I gave her my bread, all of it, but she won't wake." Caleb studied the child's eyes, and something old ached inside him. Memories of his own daughter's hunger he had been powerless to ease. "Please," the little girl whispered again. Caleb rose without answering. He walked to the table where a slaver sat fanning himself with a fly swatter. The man squinted. "You looking to make a purchase, mister?" Caleb pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and dropped it on the table. Coins spilled across the wood. "I'll take both," he said. The man raised his brows. "Both." Caleb nodded toward the child. "She comes too." The slaver leaned forward, counting. "You're buying trouble, cowboy." "I've had worse," Caleb said flatly. He lifted the girl into his arms. She clung to his neck instantly, silent and trusting. Then Caleb cut Maria down her body light as a shadow. Without another word, he carried her across the dirt while the market fell silent around him. As he passed, the child murmured into his collar, "Thank you for taking both." Caleb didn't reply. He just held them tighter. The ride to his ranch was long. The girl, Isabella, sat pressed against him in the saddle, her hands gripping his shirt. Maria lay across the saddle blanket behind, tied gently so she wouldn't fall. She never stirred. Beyond the hills, Caleb's cabin waited among cottonwoods. Few people ever came there, and he had been content with that solitude until today. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and leather. Caleb carried Maria to the bedroom, painted pale blue, a room untouched since his daughter June had died. Wooden toys still rested on the sill, and a faded photograph of June holding a lamb sat on the nightstand. Caleb laid Maria carefully on the bed and drew the quilt over her. At the doorway, Isabella whispered, "She's burning." Caleb touched Maria's forehead, then nodded. "We'll get that fever down." He set water to boil crushed willow bark and stirred in molasses. With Isabella's small hands helping, he cleaned the wounds on Maria's wrists, wrapped them in cloth, and pressed a damp rag to her temple. The girl climbed onto the bed and whispered, "Mama, wake up. I'm here." Caleb leaned against the door frame, watching candlelight flicker across the room. He hadn't seen it lit in years. Now, for the first time since loss had hollowed him, the house held another sound, besides silence, the uneven breaths of a woman fighting to live, and the steady rhythm of a child asleep at her side. And though Caleb said nothing, something deep within him stirred. The following days blurred into long hours of waiting. Maria lay still on the blue bed, her breaths shallow, her skin burning with fever. Caleb kept the fire low to keep the room warm, boiling water again and again for cloths and teas. Isabella never left her mother's side. At night, she curled at the foot of the bed, waking often to press a damp rag against Maria's forehead, whispering in Spanish and English, both hoping one would reach her. Caleb had not stepped inside that room since the day he buried his daughter. Now he entered every few hours carrying broth, fresh bandages, or just to see if Maria still breathed. He sat in the chair by the doorway, boots planted firm, rifle across his lap. Sleep came in shallow bursts, never deep. Every sound of her labored breathing kept him alert. On the third morning, as Caleb replaced the cloth on her wrists, he felt a faint twitch under his hand. Then came a groan, soft but unmistakable. Maria's eyelids fluttered open. Her gaze was sharp, wild, and afraid. Caleb froze. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You're safe now?" She struggled to sit, wincing as her ribs caught fire with pain. Her eyes darted around the room until they landed on him. "Stay back." Her voice cracked raw from thirst, but edged with defiance. Before Caleb could speak, Isabella rushed forward, climbing onto the bed. "Mama, it's me." She wrapped her thin arms around her mother's neck. Maria gasped, her hands clinging desperately to her daughter. Relief trembled through her body as she pulled the child close, tears streaming silently. Caleb stepped back, giving them space. He left the room and sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands cut and calloused, made for branding irons and fence posts, not bandages or soup ladles. And yet for days, that's exactly what they had done. Through the thin walls he heard the muffled sob of a mother and the laughter of a child. Sounds he hadn't heard in years. They stirred something long buried, but he shoved the feeling down. He had no claim here. That night, as the cabin settled into silence, Maria awoke to the faint scrape of a chair. She saw him lying just outside the doorway, blanket spread on the floor, rifle within reach. He hadn't slept in the room, hadn't touched her without reason. She thought he stayed away because he didn't care. But now she saw the truth: he was guarding them, keeping his distance, not from indifference, but respect. Still fear ruled her bones. 2 mornings later, when Caleb entered with a tray of food, Maria's fear broke into fury. She stumbled from the bed, hair-tangled wrists still ringed with bruises. Grabbing the wooden brush from the table, she held it like a weapon. "Stay away." Her voice cracked as she raised the brush. "I swear to God, if you come near me." Caleb stopped cold. He raised both hands slowly, palms open. "It's all right," he said, voice calm. But Maria couldn't hear him through the storm inside her. She swung. The brush cracked against his shoulder, then again. Her strikes weren't meant to wound, but to reclaim something stolen: her power, her will, her choice. "You bought me," she cried, tears streaking down her cheeks. "You think that gives you rights, that I belong to you now." Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He let her rage until the brush slipped from her hand and she collapsed to her knees, sobbing into her palms. "No," he said at last, one word steady as stone. Then he turned and walked out. The room fell silent except for Maria's uneven breaths. She shook with shame, confusion, and the crushing weight of not knowing who to trust. Then a soft voice came from the doorway. "He sleeps on the floor," Isabella whispered, stepping into the room. Her nightdress dragged along the floor as she walked closer. "He never touches. He makes soup. He brushes my hair, but he sleeps by the door every night. I see him." Maria lifted her head. She followed the child's gaze and noticed the folded blanket and pillow tucked near the frame, easy to miss. She realized Caleb had never once entered without knocking. What she thought was neglect was in fact care. Later that evening, when Caleb brought another tray, Maria did not speak, but she nodded. He set it down quietly and closed the door behind him. Isabella whispered stories of horses and fences, of how Mr. Ward hummed while he worked. Maria laughed softly, her first laugh in months, and for the first time since being chained, she did not feel the urge to bolt the door. The next morning, Maria stood by the window watching Caleb mend the eastern fence. His sleeves were rolled up his hands, steady on the wire. He never looked toward the house, never once showed hunger in his gaze. He was simply a man doing his work. For the first time in years, Maria felt a small flicker inside her chest. A question, not an answer. That fragile calm shattered by noon. Dust rose on the horizon as 3 riders approached their horses, kicking up the dry earth. They dismounted at the fence line, boots hitting the ground heavy with arrogance. The tallest man in a long leather duster smirked as he held up a stained sheet of paper. "Name's Doyle," he said. "We're here on business. We come for a woman named Maria, property of Mr. Mercado. Got the papers right here." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, stepping forward. He glanced at the so-called contract, nothing but ink and lies. His voice was flat. "I bought her." Doyle shook his head. "No cowboy. You bought time. She belongs to us. Hand her over and no one gets hurt." From the porch, curtains shifted. Maria's face appeared, Isabella clutching her skirts. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Get off my land," he said. The second man sneered. "Or what?" Caleb's body tensed like a cocked gun. "I paid gold," he said. "Now I'll pay blood if I must." Doyle laughed. "You must think you're some kind of hero." Before the words cooled, one of Doyle's men reached for his rifle. Caleb spun, pulling a lever hidden in the fence post. A shotgun slid into his hands. The blast tore through the air, dropping the man screaming into the dust. Chaos erupted. Doyle fired back the bullet, grazing Caleb's arm. Blood spread across his shirt. Maria screamed. Isabella cried from the porch. Caleb dropped to one knee, cocked the shotgun, and fired again, forcing Doyle behind his horse. "Next shot takes your head," Caleb growled. That was enough. Doyle and his men scrambled, dragging their wounded partner. They mounted fast and fled, dust trailing behind them. Caleb stayed on one knee, blood dripping from his sleeve until the front door burst open and Maria rushed to him, skirts whipping in the wind. She dropped to her knees, pressing trembling hands to his wound. "You're bleeding," she whispered. "Not too bad," he muttered. "You fool," she said, tears streaking down her face. "You could have been killed." He met her eyes, voice low. "I've been dead before when I lost my daughter, but today I'm alive." Caleb's shirt was soaked red, his jaw clenched tight as Maria pressed torn cloth to his arm. Blood seeped fast, but he didn't flinch. Isabella stood in the doorway, her small hands trembling as she clutched the frame, eyes wide with terror. "You're a fool," Maria whispered again, her tears mixing with dust. "Why would you risk your life for me?" Caleb's gaze was steady even through pain. "Because no one else would." She wrapped his arm as best she could, her fingers shaking but sure. For a long moment their eyes locked, her fear colliding with his unspoken grief. Then she looked away, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. That night, the cabin smelled of boiled cloth and whiskey. Caleb sat shirtless at the table, his arm resting on a folded towel chest, rising in controlled breaths. Maria stood with a kitchen knife and half a bottle of whiskey, her own hands trembling. "This will hurt," she murmured. He gave the faintest nod. "Do what you need." She poured whiskey over the wound. The sharp hiss made him grunt, but he stayed still. Then she leaned closer, knife poised. "I have to cut a little, clean it out." He met her eyes. No fear there, only trust. "Then do it." She slipped a strip of cloth between his teeth. "Bite," she whispered. He obeyed. Her palms slick with sweat, Maria lowered the blade. The steel kissed his flesh, and his whole body tensed, but he didn't jerk away. She cut away damaged tissue, dabbing with whiskey-soaked cloth, her motions quick but precise. Not driven by hatred this time, by care. When it was over, she wrapped the wound with practiced knots, breath coming fast. Her hands were stained red, but her eyes burned with determination. "You've done that before," Caleb said hoarsely. Maria set down the knife. "I had a brother in Sonora, always fighting. I patched him up more times than I can count." Silence fell softer than before. She caught sight of the photo on the mantel, the little girl with curls holding a lamb. She looked so much like Isabella, it made Maria's chest ache. "She looks like your daughter," Maria whispered. Caleb's eyes lowered. Her name was June. "What happened?" "Fever. Took her in 3 days. And your wife, gone a month later, couldn't stay in a house without June's voice." Maria swallowed hard. Her hand hovered, then rested open on the table between them. "You loved them," she said softly. Caleb's hand slowly covered hers. His fingers were rough, hers scarred, but they fit. She didn't pull away. For the first time since the chains, she felt a man's touch, not as danger, but as something steady. "You should rest," she whispered. Yet neither of them moved. The days that followed brought quiet rhythms. Maria cooked, though the eggs burned more often than not. Caleb ate every bite without complaint. Isabella drew pictures 3 stick figures under a bright yellow sun and pinned them on the wall. At night, she sometimes crawled into Caleb's bedroll by the door, whispering, "I love you, Mama. I love you, Papa," though the last word always caught in Caleb's chest. Maria noticed the small things, how Caleb brushed Isabella's hair clumsily, how he hummed while mending fences, how he never once crossed boundaries. Slowly, trust began to take root. One afternoon, he walked beside a mare while Isabella bounced in the saddle. Her legs barely reached the stirrups, but Caleb steadied her with a hand on the reins. "Easy now," he said, smiling faintly. "You're doing better than most grown folks." Isabella giggled, her cheeks flushed. Then, after a long silence, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. He caught her lifting her down. She buried her face against his chest. "Can I call you Papa now?" she whispered. Caleb froze. The world seemed to hold its breath. His throat burned, his chest ached where grief lived. He couldn't speak. So he just held her tighter, his silence becoming the answer. From the porch, Maria watched with a basket of apples in her arms. She heard her daughter's words, saw Caleb's wordless embrace. The apples tumbled into the grass as her knees gave way. Tears welled, breaking through years of fear. She pressed her hands into the earth and wept, because for the first time in so long, Isabella had spoken hope, and Caleb had not rejected it. That evening, Maria stood in his doorway while he sat by the window, lantern light on his face. "She called you Papa," she said softly. He nodded. "I heard." "She's never called anyone that before," Maria whispered. Caleb's voice was rough. "I didn't know what to say." "You didn't have to." she said, moving closer. She knelt beside him, her hand finding his. "You brought her back to life. And me too." He lifted her fingers to his lips, kissing them as if they were sacred. The sun rose golden the next morning as Caleb stood at the forge, shaping a ring from a broken revolver pin. Rough, simple, strong, like the woman it was meant for. Maria stepped outside, brushing Isabella's hair, her white dress fluttering in the breeze. Caleb walked to her, the ring cooling in his palm. "I lost everything," he said quietly. His eyes held hers. "But you and Isabella, you gave me something to live for." Her hand trembled as she took the ring. She looked at the scar still faint on her wrist, then back at him, and she nodded. Yes, the wedding came without fanfare, but with a kind of reverence the frontier rarely offered. Caleb had not sent for crowds yet, word carried. A handful of neighbors gathered at a respectful distance, bringing what little they could, a bouquet of wildflowers from the seamstress, Miss Alberta, 2 dresses stitched in haste but with love, and a preacher who agreed to speak simple vows under the open sky. The field behind Caleb's cabin was dressed in petals. Isabella skipped ahead with a basket nearly too big for her scattering blooms, with a joy that lifted every heart. Her curls bounced, her laughter filled the air, and her tiny voice sang, "We're all 3 now." Maria walked slowly behind her daughter. She wore the white dress Miss Alberta had sewn plain cotton, hand-stitched at the seams, but when the sunlight caught it, she glowed. The scars on her wrist and collarbone were visible, but she made no effort to hide them. They told her story, and today there was no shame in survival. Caleb waited at the altar, nothing more than 2 crates covered with linen. His hair had been combed for the first time in weeks, and he wore a button shirt stiff at the collar. But it was his eyes that set him apart, softer lit with something that had long been buried. When Maria reached him, she whispered, "I never dreamed I'd wear white again." "You earned it," Caleb replied, voice steady. The preacher's words were brief, the vows even briefer. But when Caleb and Maria sealed them with a kiss, slow and trembling, it was more than a union. It was a quiet declaration that 2 broken souls had found one another and chosen to heal. Isabella ran between them, grabbing both hands. "Now we're all 3, she said, beaming. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was steady. "Yes, mi amor. All 3. The days after the wedding unfolded with a rhythm as fragile as it was beautiful. Mornings began in the kitchen. Maria, unused to the stove, burned the eggs twice that first week, but Caleb ate every bite without complaint. Isabella mashed beans with her small hands, proud of every stir. In the evenings, they sat on the porch. Caleb cleaned his rifle, Maria stitched dresses from leftover cloth, and Isabella drew pictures on the scraps of paper. 3 figures holding hands beneath the sun. She pinned them to the wall beside the hearth, one after another, until the cabin began to look less like a place of ghosts and more like a home. At night, Isabella often slipped between them in bed, her voice drowsy as she whispered, "I love you, Mama. I love you, Papa." Every time Maria's eyes blurred, not with fear anymore, but with the kind of joy that hurt, because it was new, fragile, and real. Sundays brought church. Maria walked beside Caleb, her scars uncovered. No one dared whisper now. Not after Caleb had shed blood to protect her. Not after the vows beneath wildflowers. Isabella sat proudly between them, coloring quietly during the sermon, her little drawings spilling into hymnals. Life on the ranch continued. Fences needed mending, horses needed training, and the land needed work. But the silence that once weighed heavy was now filled with laughter. children's footsteps and conversation between two people learning to speak across pain. Maria's English grew steadier, her Spanish often slipping in, but Caleb listened patiently, answering in his slow, measured drawl. One afternoon, Maria found a yellow dress in a dusty trunk in the loft. It had belonged to Caleb's daughter, June. She pressed it to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks, then gave it to Isabella that evening. The child twirled in the fading light, the skirt spinning wide. Caleb watched from the porch, eyes glassy, hands folded tight. "You okay?" Maria asked gently, standing beside him. He nodded. For the first time in a long while, yes. The seasons turned. Together, they built a new fence, painted the barn, repaired a swing that had hung broken for years. Caleb carved a wooden plaque and nailed it above the porch, La Casa de Esperanza, the House of Hope. Maria kissed him as he hammered the last nail. On the morning of the first frost, Maria stood at the edge of the fields, whispering a prayer in Spanish gratitude, farewell to fear and welcome to whatever lay ahead. Caleb stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You still scared?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Not anymore." Inside on the wall above the hearth hung Isabella's latest drawing, a family of 3 hearts sketched over their chests. Beneath it, Maria had written one word in careful English script, home. By winter's end, the little ranch had become more than land and timber. It was laughter healing and the simple miracle of survival shared. Neighbors spoke of Caleb Ward not just as the man who lived alone with ghosts, but as the rancher who chose a woman and her child when no one else would. Maria, once trampled and chained, walked into town with her head-high scars uncovered. Isabella skipped at her side hand in hand with the man she now called Papa. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone who saw them knew that in a world of dust and loss, something rare had taken root. Family forged not by blood, but by courage. The months rolled gently into years, the ranch reshaping itself with every season. What had once been a hollow cabin on lonely land grew into something that pulsed with life. Maria filled the mornings with scents of beans bread and the occasional pot of stew that actually turned out right. Caleb taught Isabella to saddle her pony to braid rope, and even to whistle sharp enough to call the cattle in from the hills. Isabella's laughter became the loudest sound on the land. She ran barefoot through the fields, her curls bouncing as she shouted for Mama and Papa to watch. Caleb carved her toys from spare wood horses' dolls a whistle she wore around her neck until the string frayed to threads. Maria sewed dresses from leftover cloth, sometimes lopsided, but each one a small victory. Their life was not easy. The work was backbreaking. Some nights, storms pounded the roof until they feared it would collapse. There were lean weeks when beans and cornbread were the only food, when every penny went toward repairing fences or buying medicine. But the weight was carried together. That was the difference. At night, when Isabella finally fell asleep curled between them, Maria would whisper in broken English, "We are family." Caleb would answer simply, "We are." One autumn afternoon, Maria stood at the edge of the field where blue bonnets had bloomed the spring before. She held Isabella's hand as they watched Caleb hammer the last board on a rebuilt corral. The sun caught the sweat on his brow, his shirt torn at the sleeve, his body still scarred from old wounds. Yet his movements were steady, each strike purposeful. Isabella tugged at her mother's hand. "Papa's strong," she said proudly. Maria smiled. "Yes, mi amor. He is." But in her heart, she knew his strength was not just in muscle. It was in silence when anger would have been easier. It was in patience when fear threatened to break her apart. It was in the quiet way he kept his promises. That winter, Maria opened an old trunk in the loft and found a quilt Caleb's wife had once sewn. She spread it across their bed, not as a shadow of the past, but as a sign that grief no longer had the last word. Caleb said nothing when he saw it, only brushed his hand across the fabric with a softness that Maria understood. The years after their wedding were marked by small rituals. Caleb brought Maria wildflowers each spring, sometimes crookedly bundled with twine. Isabella pinned more of her drawings to the hearth wall, covering it with suns' hearts and stick figures holding hands. Maria began teaching her letters by candlelight while Caleb listened with quiet pride. When Isabella asked questions why Mama's wrists had scars, why Papa sometimes stared too long at the photograph of June, Maria and Caleb answered honestly. They spoke of pain without hiding it, so their daughter would know that wounds do not make love weaker. They make it real. Neighbors who had once pitied Caleb began to respect him again, not because of cattle counts or land size, but because he had chosen compassion when others would have walked away. Some whispered that Maria was lucky. Others whispered that Caleb was. The truth, as they both knew, was that they all were because survival had given them one another. One crisp morning, frost kissed the cottonwood silver. Maria stepped outside with Caleb's coat in her hands. She found him already in the field smoke curling from the forge he had built anew. In his palm cooled a piece of brass shaped into a small plaque. When he nailed it above the door, the letters carved into it read, La Casa de Esperanza, the House of Hope. Maria whispered, running her fingers across the wood. Caleb nodded, his voice low. That's what you gave me. She leaned against him, and for the first time she believed it fully. Years later, Isabella would remember those early mornings, the smell of bread and wood smoke, the way her mother's voice mixed Spanish and English into lullabies, and her father's quiet strength as he rode beside her on horseback. She would tell her own children how once she had been a frightened girl who begged a stranger to take her mother instead of her, and how that stranger said nothing, but took both. In a world that too often chooses silence over courage, Caleb chose to act. He did not buy Maria and Isabella as property, he chose them as family. Maria, once broken by chains, discovered that scars could become symbols of strength when met with respect instead of cruelty. And little Isabella, who had known hunger and fear, taught them both that, even in the dust of the frontier, love could take root. Their story is not about perfection. It is about grit, grace, and the courage to hold on when the world says, let go. It is about building family not by blood, but by choice, the most powerful bond of all. So, dear listener, if this story touched your heart, remember this real love does not always arrive with flowers or music. Sometimes it comes with silence, with sacrifice, with someone willing to stand beside you when everyone else turns away. Tell me in the comments what part of their journey moved you most. And if you believe in stories of redemption, resilience, and love that endures the storm, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next tale. Because hearts may break, dust may settle, but true love, the kind forged through fire, never fades.